in any seminar or in a conference, it should not be conclusive. If it is so conclusive, it comes like a workshop organized by the ministries and the decision makers for recommendations. That is not an intellectual discourse. So let me add a bit of confusion to the discussion and the debate that is taking place. I'll start by saying, sir, instead of knowledge, democracy, I will add a word and, knowledge and democracy. Why I am making this point is that both knowledge and democracy are perhaps a part of the menu of the rich countries. And that is something, when he was talking about inequalities in knowledge production, it is very important. If you see in the 1950s and 60s, when many countries got independence and liberated from the colonial past, what one finds is that democracy was practiced only in the Western world or in the United States and the rich countries. The poor countries did not practice democracy. The only exception at that point of time, thanks to our initial freedom fighters and leaders, especially Nehru, etc. India was one of the countries with the lowest per capita income that followed and practiced democracy. Another example was Costa Rica. And all the rich countries, the non-oil producing rich countries, followed democracy, perhaps with the exception of Singapore. That used to be the distribution of democracy. So when I say that it's a rich man's menu, this is the meaning of what I mean to say that. It has also links to, if you look at the knowledge generation that is taking place, I come to knowledge diffusion at a later stage. Knowledge generation that is taking place, we will find that it is also concentrated. It is also rich man's menu. It is not coming from the developing countries. And if you see, say for example, Nobel laureates in the world, between 1900 and 1921, there are 1,975 Nobel laureates are created in the world. I'm not saying 1,975 Nobel prizes were given, because sometimes the prizes are shared by 2 or 3 people. And out of that, you find that 40% are from United States. Very rarely you come across anybody from the third world. And out of that, what you find is that 35% are immigrants. So you find that, when I am talking about democratizing knowledge production that is taking place, there are different levels at which one has to see. Because I see that the theory is nothing but generalization of practices. And practices do not take place in the universities and in the laboratories. It takes place in the communities. That is the place where we had to look for knowledge production, how do we change the knowledge production, how do we create knowledge diffusion, and what are the different ways and methods of creating this. And what you find is that in all these circumstances, universities, as it was very rightly pointed out by the initial discussions, have tried to legitimize their monopoly of producing knowledge and try to keep it distant from the community. Because, as it was mentioned, any measure of good academic record that you find either by Scopus or any other agency, you find that if you keep your hand away from soiling your hands with the community participation, you get better publications and you get better recognition. So going to the community means you are in a position to trade off between your academic standing and what you do for considered to be good for the community. This is a perpetual conflict. I cite an example. I went to one of the universities for evaluation. One of the universities in Malaysia. The only one Apex University, University Science Malaysia, Penang. So we went for an evaluation. And we found that they talk about community participation quite a lot. But at the same time, it is not happening. So we had discussions with the professors. So professors felt that they are renowned and the university has its credibility because they do not do community participation. This is the discussion that is taking place. We have a book, we have written about it and published as a book from OECD. Why? Because the moment you go to community participation, the methodology that you use is mostly qualitative. And what you get is the quantitative methods and rigor of statistical analysis. So when I was doing hierarchical linear models in 1990s in the education sector, at that time, sir, you are aerodynamics, that's what you said. At that time, there were not many people who could read and comment on the methodology that is used because it is not used perhaps at that point of time in India. So what is happening is that the university sector in India for the knowledge production, I am not talking about the community participation, empirical studies are very rarely conducted in India to carry out the research and produce knowledge in the country. That means going to the community, collecting the data, whether it is quantitative or qualitative. This is a change that you find. And you find that the university publication, most of the publications, they are based on the NSS data, census data, family welfare data, these 3-4 sources of data. And that is playing with the numbers, rather than getting into the reality of the issues. Your statistical rigor may be sophisticated, but you produce a good article, but it is far away from the reality of where the action takes place. So that is the point that it is very important in the universities. It is the research institutions in India at least, in the social sciences if you take, at least there are 29 or 30 institutions established by ICSSR in the social sciences, where you find that the institutional research is more centered around primary data collection, the knowledge generation that is taking place. So there is a process. And decolonization of knowledge generation or diffusion that has taken place in many countries. Say for example in Africa, it was in the form of Africanization of higher education. And there was a big movement in Uganda. If you remember during Idi Amin's period, all the Indians were driven out of Uganda. And if you go to Kenya, you will find the same thing. If you go to Nigeria, in a lesser degree, you will find this. In many countries, there was a process by which decolonization took place. And decolonization meant that nationalization of the knowledge transaction in the first place, the knowledge production in the second place. Because many of the people who were trained in the colonial countries for transaction of knowledge, and many of the teachers, including in India, many of the universities, what you find is that this is the way that knowledge transaction took place, and the knowledge production also helped. And if you see that, universities in India had no tradition of research and knowledge production. It was in 1907, Ashutosh Mukherjee's presidential address in Calcutta University, which said that no, universities should have knowledge production. That is how many of the great scientists at that point of time were brought to Calcutta University, and they were given money to start laboratories, and that is the way research gave. Why? Because we followed the London model. And what you find is that the British model, universities were administrative arrangements, and teaching used to take place in the colleges. So here also it used to be the pattern. Today, if you see that 80% of the higher education institutions, 80% of the higher education institutions are engaged in undergraduate studies. 80% of the students are in the undergraduate studies. And the undergraduate studies is not part of the university. It is only in some universities where language teaching, etc. takes place at the undergraduate level. Otherwise, universities teach at the master's level, which is called internationally graduate level, or research level. So this is the division of labor in terms of the knowledge distribution that takes place, diffusion that takes place. You started, Dr. Tandon, by saying that learning is changing. I say that modes of learning is changing, but what is not changing is learning. Levels of learning. The biggest crisis that is taking place in India is schooling without learning. So this is what is important, and what is also happening is that the public system is negating learning, and that is why the new education policy talked about, it did not talk about schools, it did not talk about colleges, it did not talk about universities, it talked about focus on learning. See, I come from the institute, I was vice chancellor of the university called National Institute of Education Planning. I think we should talk about planning for learning, not planning for setting up institutions. A stage has come whereby all studies, the first study in India were conducted by us in 1990s in Madhya Pradesh. Then there were studies conducted by ASSAR and the studies conducted by NAS, by NCRT. All the studies come to one conclusion, that students are not learning what they are supposed to learn. So when I talk about learning, schooling without learning, this is the meaning. So I am talking about even diffusion is in a different function. And if you talk about one good thing that has happened is that, whether it is in India or Africa or Latin America, one common feature is that when we talk about knowledge production and research that is taking place, we are looking westward. We do not look to our left side and right side. We look to the west. So the western orientation is still dominant in the when we talk about knowledge production. So can there be research collaborations, knowledge production collaborations that can take place between developing countries, between India and Africa, between India in Asian countries? That is the challenge in the collaborative research, that we can change the status of research and inquiry and the way it is conducted to this year. But this will not answer the question. If you take the knowledge production, as I mentioned, it is concentrated. And the top ranking universities are research universities. And if you take these research universities, they do not move away from the elite nature. Or in other words, even when institutions are released in number, when higher education was an elite one, then it's a massification, then it's a universalization of higher education. Don't misunderstand. The knowledge production still remains elite in nature because it is not linked to the communities that they are serving, or the communities where you find a substantial change that has to be taking place. So the question is that how do we generate demand for such knowledge? I'm not talking about supply. Most of the discussions were there, how do we generate that knowledge? But my point is that knowledge generation takes place when there is a demand for that. And how do we generate that demand for such knowledge generation is the one. So for example, an institution in Korea may be undertaking research, may be producing knowledge, but how do we create demand for that? So my question I said, to Dr. Rajesh and to all others is that it is important that we have to change the locus of knowledge production and the process of knowledge diffusion. And India, in terms of knowledge diffusion, it was mentioned about the GER, you find that we are moving very fast. We have been moving very fast. That is very important. But at the same time, how do we try to produce knowledge? And that is where democratization becomes important. But unfortunately, a point that is not touched upon is that the market processes and knowledge production. And if you see from the 90s, late 80s onwards, with the globalization process, higher education has become a commodity to be placed on the market. And if you see general agreement of trade and services, what you find is that it is accepted as a commodity to be traded, cross-border trading that should take place in education. This has a lot to do with knowledge production. There are two implications of this. If you see the funding agencies, in many developing countries, research is promoted by the funding agencies. And what the funding agencies want, they start a process, midday meals, whether it is effective or not. Then after 2 years, this can be scaled up. But the conclusions are first drawn before the research questions are formulated. That is the process of knowledge generation that is taking place, which is not discussed very systematically in many places, So conclusions are drawn, methodology is given, and then you are given a consultancy for $5,000 or $4,000 to carry out and prove what is funded by the funding agency. It's a very distorted way of knowledge. Perhaps we don't want that knowledge, Perhaps that knowledge is more dangerous for our national development. That knowledge is very dangerous for the social development of the country, We do not want perhaps that knowledge, So what knowledge, whose knowledge becomes very important. That's why I was talking about the demand part of the knowledge generation that is taking place becomes very, very important, India has gone through this process of, when you talk about the corporatization of knowledge production that is taking place globally. The difference is that they look only at those things which can produce profit. See, corporate sector depends on the market. Market understands only two things, prices and profits. High prices and high profits, they are positively associated and correlated. And knowledge production has become a profitable venture by the corporate sector. And the entry of corporate sector has totally distorted the way in which knowledge production takes place. There was a big study done in the European universities. What happened to research after the public funding has declined? What they found was that the time spent on research of the professors remained the same. But the areas and topics selected for research has totally changed, which has been more in terms of what is needed for the market and what is needed for the market expansion. So the question is that whether we need national development or we need market expansion. How we can marry and manage markets and massification and expansion, that becomes the question. So therefore, I'll come back to the question of saying that in fact, theory is nothing but a generalization of practices. But these practices need to be not created in a classroom condition, in a well-defined condition. It should be the condition in which actual practice takes place. So we should not control that. We should generalize from that practices. That is the knowledge that is generated. That is the place where the universities are not in a position to provide a good insight into the type of things, the type of research that is carried out, and the design of research that is carried out. And funding has a lot to do with the arrangement that is taking place now. So my request is that we should try to identify what is the demand for the knowledge that we generate. That will further democratize the knowledge production, the demand for knowledge production. And that will give us more opportunities for funding and developing capacities, etc. The contributions made by Priya in these directions are very important. And my request is that we have to extend further, more forcefully, to more people who will be supporters and creating a network like that. That will be very useful. I hope this seminar also will be a route in that right direction. Thank you very much.